Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm David Clement, guest hosting for Tanya Granick-Allen. Premier Doug Ford has won a second majority government, making him the third premier in the last 50 years to do so in Ontario, increasing the Progressive Conservative seat count to a total of 83. Now, while the PCs increased their seat total, the campaign was largely seen as a disaster for both the NDP and the Ontario Liberals. What happened? How did Doug Ford cruise through to another majority government? And what does this mean for the future of the opposition parties? And more importantly, does this election result in Ontario give us any indication of what could happen federally? Joining me to unpack this is Michael Diamond, principal of the Upstream Group. Michael, thank you very much for joining me on Counterpoint.
Happy to be here.
So right off the top, what was Doug Ford's recipe for re-election?
Look, I think there were several key components to why the massive re-election victory occurred for Doug Ford on June 2nd. And I think you have to look at it in several buckets. I mean, first of all, he did provide stable, competent, reassuring leadership throughout the COVID pandemic. And that's something that I think surprised a lot of people and made him friends in areas where before he may have been a little bit weaker. Then you have to look at the effort that his government, led by Minister Monty McNaughton, put at turning enemies into friends without making their friends into enemies. And that was with the effort of bringing on growing support with trade unions or groups that had traditionally been very hostile to progressive conservatives, organizations that used to fund the Working Families Coalition, which destroyed Tim Hudak's chances of becoming premier, endorsed Doug Ford progressive conservatives, so he had growth. And you saw that pay off in some of the ridings that the progressive conservatives picked up, be it in Timmins or Windsor-Tecumseh in Essex. So you cannot underestimate that enough. And then that you just have to contrast his election narrative to his opponents. Doug Ford was very clear and concise in how he communicated. It was a very simple message. It was a very straightforward message, and it really resonated because it was easy to understand and addressed problems that voters saw for themselves.
And on that note of addressing voters and what their concerns were, do you think that maybe the Liberals and the NDP miscalculated in trying to use the pandemic as an attempt to wedge the premier to run on his record?
Absolutely. And they did. That was a miscalculation for a number of reasons. One, I think Stephen Del Duca, Doug Ford, throughout the pandemic, was able to defer that he was taking advice from the chief medical officer of health, something that I think is actually reassuring. This is a matter of great importance. And there are certainly areas where, the politicians do have to lead. But in terms of the science, deferring to experts is not a bad idea. Stephen Del Duca made it clear he would not always do that when he announced that he would mandate vaccines for children to return to school, something that the chief medical officer of health has advised against at this point. So that was, I think, a first point where it actually made Doug Ford the pro-science candidate in that discussion and showed that he was leading from competency and an evidence and expertise. So that was one. The other was that Doug Ford actually did deliver and was that reassuring leader that I mentioned through COVID. So there was no points to gain there. And the Del Duca and Horvath message on it was just so disjointed, be it Stephen Del Duca's kickoff rally indoors with a couple hundred people that was maskless, and then a few days later announcing that he wanted to reintroduce a mask mandate at grocery stores. It was contradictory and hypocritical and really rang havoc for the electorate.
And so, I mean, you've spoken to Premier Ford's record. How much of this would you chalk up to poor campaigning on the side of the two opposition parties?
Well, I think, they're both important factors here. I think Premier Ford and the work that he put in and the re-election campaign he ran definitely deserved to win and be reelected. But from that same token, I mean, I believe, especially at a time like now, where we've all been through a really hard 2.5 years, and it's varied and it's been different in how we've all experienced it, but we've all changed our lives and we've all suffered, and we wanted hope and optimism. And both opposition leaders started. Stephen Del Duca's first campaign announcement announcement was telling folks what he wouldn't do in saying no to Highway 413, which turned out to be so popular that Doug Ford swept Peel region for the first time. The Progressive Conservatives have done that since in my lifetime. I can't even remember when that had happened before.
Yeah.
But Stephen Del Duca started off saying what he wouldn't do, saying no, and that just fed into Doug Ford's hands of wanting to build the province and his plan to get it done and say yes.
We'll get right back to Stephen Del Duca and Andrea Horwath right after this break. And we're back on Counterpoint with Michael Diamond, principal with the Upstream Group. Michael, before the break, you were talking about some of the campaign gaffes or inconsistencies on the side of Liberal leader Stephen Del Duca. He wasn't the only political casualty of this election. Andrea Horwath has stepped down as leader of the NDP. Where do you see, or what went wrong with the NDP's strategy going into this election?
Well, a number of things. And there were two things that happened that were really out of Andrea Horwath's control, which did impact her and frankly had an impact in some of the seats that they lost that they previously held. I'm thinking Thunder Bay, Atikokan, and Timmins specifically. Andrea Horwath was unfortunate to contract COVID and have to go into self-isolation in the campaign. That's not a mistake. That's just a bout of bad luck. And it's certainly unfortunate for her. The self-isolation occurred when she was supposed to do a tour through Northern Ontario, where she did lose those two seats. She did manage to grab one from the Liberals, though, in Thunder Bay Superior North. Then, a few weeks later, she was supposed to return to Northern Ontario, and on the day of her tour, her plane malfunctioned, and she had to reroute and stay in Southern Ontario. So she had two very bad, just bouts of luck that were out of her control. But certainly, she also ran opposed to the 413. We saw candidates then coming out in favor of it and, trying to talk out of both sides of their mouths because it was very locally popular, and certainly losing the support of those trade labor unions that used to fund the Working Families Coalition, often the bread and butter of NDP get out the vote efforts were these organizations, and to lose them to Doug Ford, not just have them stay neutral, but to come out and oppose, to have her former MPP Paul Miller in Hamilton's East Stony Creek come out and say that the NDP has lost their way under her. She was a victim of all of that, and the NDP's forgetting their roots, forgetting that they are the party of labor and trying to become the party of downtown Toronto and downtown Ottawa.
Yeah, so do you see this as a divide almost between what I would call like faculty lounge politics and working class families? Maybe the NDP has forgotten its historical roots in terms of who they represented. And for reasons maybe you can enlighten us on, Doug Ford has attracted many of those voters, people who voted NDP their entire life, who have now voted for Doug Ford twice.
Absolutely. And I think you hit the nail on the head that it's really a great divide between two traditional constituency groups of the NDP. One has really that labor faction, the folks who used to deliver Oshawa to the federal NDP fairly consistently, but it's been a conservative seat since 2004 now. But those folks who've really stayed the same. Their concerns hasn't changed. They want to have better working conditions, better wages, more jobs, and a stronger economy so we don't see layoffs and plant closures. And then that faculty lounge sect that you mentioned, which has frankly become more left-wing and more caught up in higher taxes and more regulation and really actually looking to displace the jobs that those labor unions fill. So they went from being able to coexist on some common ground to being a house divided, and Doug Ford did sweep in and took advantage of that, and it's not unprecedented. We saw that with Boris Johnson's win in the United Kingdom in the last election, where he regained the conservative majority. We saw an attempt; it was an unsuccessful attempt by Aaron O'Toole to do the same here in Canada in the 2021 election. So certainly, Doug Ford, I think, is the first in Canada to really strongly do it, but I think we'll see more of that as the NDP continue to be lost to the woke crowd over the lunch bucket crowd.
So we have about a minute before we go to break. Why hasn't this recipe worked federally? A lot of federal conservatives talked about the need to win the 905. Here, Doug Ford has won every seat except for one in the 905. Why hasn't that translated over to federal politics?
Well, if you look, Stephen Harper did almost sweep the 905 in the 2011 campaign, and then in 2014, Kathleen Wynne regained the Liberal. The Liberals won the 2011 election in Ontario provincially, and then in 2014, Kathleen Wynne turned it into an increased majority, and they was both of those wins were heavily focused on the 905. So, historically speaking, Ontario will split their ticket and elect a plurality of Liberal MPPs or MPs and do the inverse with the Conservatives. So it's historically precedented to have this divide. So if we're going to look and try and read the tea leaves of what this means for the federal situation, it actually probably means renewed support for Justin Trudeau in a future federal election within this Conservative mandate.
And we're back on Counterpoint. I'm joined by Michael Diamond, principal with the Upstream Group. Michael, one of the key stories that have come out after the election here in Ontario is low voter turnout. Do you think that had any impact on the final result?
Look, I think it's certainly concerning and troubling trend. I would personally like to see increased voter turnout, regardless of the result. It's important that people are engaged. I don't think it had a major increase outcome on the results, but I think there's several reasons why we saw decreased voter turnout. One, people have changed their habits because of COVID. There are people who might unfortunately look at democracy as a non-essential trip. We've had 3 elections in Ontario since the 2018 election, a municipal election and 2 federal elections. So there's a bit of voter fatigue, and then and it's something I touched on earlier, and this is where it may have had an impact on the results. Right now, I don't think people are motivated by anger and saying no. And Stephen Del Duca and Kathleen Wynne based their campaigns on not being Doug Ford and the projects that they would cancel and say no to. So the Progressive Conservatives lost vote. The Liberals and NDP lost a significantly larger portion of their vote staying home. So I think Conservatives actually turned out. Doug Ford maintained a lot of his vote. There were 2 splinter Conservative parties that weren't on the ballot last time. That both one received over 100,000 votes. One received, I believe, about 80,000 votes with the Ontario Party and the New Blue Party. And so Conservatives showed up to vote. It was actually, I think, Liberal and NDP voters who stayed home, and that was because their campaign demotivated them from turning out.
And I mean, part of the autopsy of both the Liberal and NDP strategy has sparked 2 conversations. One being, is there a need for a merge? And 2 being, does Ontario need proportional representation? I'd love your take on both of those questions.
Well, look, I mean, it's funny. Every time Conservatives form government, there's this renewed interest in changing how we elect people because the smart and fancy people are upset that their neighbors voted in a way that they didn't like. So, no, I think, this was put to voters in 2007 of changing Ontario's electoral system. Voters resoundingly rejected it. There was a preference to keep voting simple. And, I don't think we should. I don't think it's a necessary conversation. And it's certainly not a conversation that should occur without consent from the electorate. It should not happen the way Justin Trudeau considered. If we are to change how we vote, it must be voted upon by the electorate. Number one. In terms of the NDP and Liberals merging, I'm not going to pretend they'll be overly interested in what a conservative activist like myself has to say on that matter. But I think. They both need to rebuild and clean up their own houses. I think the NDP needs to have a conversation internally about who they are. Are they going to continue to move to that woke left, or are they going to try and regain some of that working class sensibility that they used to have under leaders like Stephen Lewis or even in Ottawa in previous incarnations of their party, Alexa McDonough, for example? Or are they going to go further to the left? The Liberals, I think, they really could not have picked a better leader for the other parties than they did in their 2020 leadership election when they selected Stephen Del Duca. He was an unmitigated disaster, and I think they need to refocus on how they select their leaders. Where Stephen Del Duca was able to mobilize some of the campus clubs and the Carpenters Union, which he used to work for, to really just trounce his opponents who may have been better electorally positioned to win a general election. So I think they need to reconsider how they elect their leader, and probably should move to the approach that the Progressive Conservatives take in a one member, one vote process. They'll get a better result if they are to do that.
And so with about a minute to go, on the note of Liberal leadership, how they pick their leader, do you see anyone from the federal party maybe jumping ship and seeking the leadership of the Liberal Party now that space is vacant?
It's an awfully hard thing to expect a member of parliament who has a very nice, cushy job, and with the Accord, with the NDP, a fairly safe job where they're racking up a pension, to leave that job to take over a party that doesn't have official party status, and there isn't even an obvious seat to be vacated to make room for the leader. So I think if the Liberals wait 2 years to have that leadership selection, perhaps there'll be an appetite for a Trudeau MP to come back to Ontario and try and save the party. But if they rush into that, I don't think there'd be any scenario in which they would do it. They'd have no salary, no seat in the legislature, and no official party status.
Okay, so we'll just have to wait. We'll have to wait and see the order of events to figure out how that one unfolds. We'll have a little bit more after the break. And we're back on Counterpoint. I'm with Michael Diamond from the Upstream Group. So, Michael, Premier Doug Ford, you mentioned that in the eyes of many, he was seen as a stable, consistent manager in regards to the pandemic. In the minds of many people, although the virus is certainly not behind us, the pandemic and the restrictions are. What does a new, energized Ford majority look like over the course of the next 4 years?
Well, I think we have to look to the budget that was tabled, that was never passed, and then became the party's election platform, and will be, per the Premier's pledge, be reintroduced nearly identical when the House resumes. So I think that will be really the first year, and the themes there: building the key infrastructure, developing the Ring of Fire, and investing in jobs for the future. So I do imagine that's what we'll see Doug Ford turning his focus on. Leaving, obviously public health will remain important, but that will include addressing the surgical backlog that was caused by COVID, and modernizing how we deliver some services to make sure that we can do that, building those long-term care spaces as he promised throughout the election. And really one thing that I think is personally very passionate to him, making Ontario the electric vehicle manufacturing capital of North America. It's not something, frankly, that would have even been on the radar of the province without his particular vision. So I think we're going to see a major focus on that.
And in regards to those initiatives and how they play out, what do you think are some of the things that Premier Ford should avoid? What are maybe some of the traps or issue areas that he should avoid addressing or stepping his toes in over the next 4 years?
Look, I think, we saw the Liberals try and lay some traps throughout the election, and it just didn't work. The firearm debate that they nonsensically inserted into a provincial election when it wasn't top of mind, trying to turn a United States Supreme Court decision into an Ontario election decision on the Roe v. Wade decision that was leaked out early in the campaign, because they thought that would trip Doug Ford up. So I think it's Doug Ford's a hard guy to trip up, and we saw where they tried to do it. So he'll certainly want to avoid some of those issues, and I think he just needs to remain focused like he did throughout the election. The pandemic was very chaotic and traumatic and the negative experience. We need to focus on the future, building those roads, building those bridges, building those that public transit infrastructure, training people for the jobs of the future. So if he stays focused on what he personally cares about, I think the government will be off to a very strong start, while the other parties are looking at rebuilding.
And so one of the things that, in my view, made his re-election so interesting is that going back-to-back majorities is rare. Going back-to-back majorities and increasing your seat count is rare. We saw a lot of Doug Ford throughout the pandemic, and some have argued that he is the type of politician where the more people see him, the more people hear from him, the more likable he is, despite maybe some of his gaffes and his peculiarities. Do you think that that's maybe an accurate take on the pulse of Ontario voters right now?
I think absolutely that's correct. I think they got to see Doug Ford unfiltered throughout COVID, and he became a guy they came to like. And if you look at the campaign themes, in my riding, for example, when I got literature from the Liberal candidate, you'd have no idea that the candidate in the University of Rosedale was running for Stephen Del Duca's Liberal Party, because his name was absent, his photo was absent, he was invisible on her local campaign. Progressive Conservatives proudly put Doug Ford, local candidates proudly put Doug Ford at the front and center of their campaign. He was a net positive. And, so you're 100% right. Not only was it a majority in the last election, it was actually a landslide majority. It was a very large and substantial majority. So to increase seats from a majority, as you said, is rare. To go from a landslide to an even bigger landslide is really, really a tough thing to do. So obviously the premier hit a home run with the public, and the voters rewarded his candidates for that.
Well, Michael, it's been a pleasure to have you on Counterpoint. Thank you very much for joining us. Always appreciate your commentary here on all things Ontario politics.
Thanks for having me.
So Doug Ford has another majority. Now is the time to see what a Doug Ford government looks like without COVID in the background. We'll have to see what happens.